now. So yes, here you are. It's very exciting to be able to kind of kick off the conference with everyone. And so we'll just dive right in here. My name is Jessica Jones. I'm a teacher at Literacy Minnesota, and I currently teach a intermediate and advanced ESL class, although class has changed, and even I think what I would call my class has changed a lot in the last year, as sort of the same group of students has just stayed with me as we've moved into online for a whole year. So with that in mind, let me turn it over to my co-presenter, Liddy Rich.
Hi, everyone. It is great to be together this morning. I'm Liddy Rich. I teach ESL also. I teach an intermediate English language class at Harmony. I also teach at Harmony Learning Center. It's in Maplewood, Minnesota. I also teach a reading skills class, and I've been teaching remotely on Zoom since March.
Great. All right, so now we're going to ask you to tell us a little bit about you and what brings you to this session today. So in just a moment, you should get a couple of questions on your screen as part of a poll. Take a minute to answer those questions. You can check as many boxes as apply to you, and that will just help us know a little bit about who you are, what you do, and what you're interested in today. All right, you should be seeing that poll on your screen now. All right, I'll give you just a second or two more. It looks like almost everyone has answered the poll. All right. And then you can kind of see where we are at as a group. You should be able to see the answers now. So it's interesting, I think there's a greater diversity in this group than I've seen in a while in terms of what types of instructional model people are in right now. All right, great. So what we're going to talk about today, I would say, are things that can be easily used in any synchronous environment. So that could be in-person instruction or teaching over Zoom or Google Meet. It is designed to be conversation. So that is a little harder to pull off in the asynchronous model. It usually takes the form of something like video recordings or discussion rooms. And good, okay, and we have a pretty wide range of levels represented today. So if you are teaching low literacy or beginning ESL, bear with us. The first part of this is gonna feel a little high. So don't panic if it feels like, well, I could never do this with the level of students that I work with, because we're gonna get there as we're gonna kind of work backwards today, starting with a higher level interaction and then talking about how you can break that down to its fundamental pieces. All right. So here's what we're up to today. We're going to talk a little bit about how to create a supportive learning environment, or why supportive learning environments are important for this kind of meaningful conversation work. Then we're going to really focus in on three skills that we think, from our experience, have helped students have better and more meaningful interactions with each other in classroom conversation. And then we're going to show you one flexible activity that and a bunch of different ways to adapt that activity in order to practice those 3 conversation skills. We're also going to spend a little time talking about what makes for good questions or prompts in conversation. I will just say one thing that we are not going to do today is we're not really going to get into the nitty-gritty of the technical stuff about using different platforms. But if you have questions about that, if you're new to any of these platforms or not sure how to do things like breakout groups, I really encourage you to visit Literacy Minnesota's website of remote tutoring resources. There is a whole collection there of tutorials, links to videos, picture-based things that you can even use with learners or with volunteers. So take a look at those, and Heather, if you can chat out that link to folks, that would be great. All right, so jumping right in here. What do students need to really engage in meaningful conversation? And I would say that, you know, this isn't so much about skills, right? That's your clue. What I have found more so this year than I think any time in my teaching history is that students need to feel safe and valued and connected, and everything about the interactions with students and volunteers right now during the pandemic and online, and a lot of the reading I've been doing in my own time this year has really reinforced this idea that our relationships, our connections, and how you create that sense of safety are, they're the first step, because without that, students can't possibly focus on the work of building language skills. And this is really supported in the work of Zaretta Hammond, this book that lots of people are reading right now, Culturally Responsive Teaching and the Brain. And she says, brain science tells us that the brain is always, the brain seeks to minimize social threats and to maximize opportunities to connect with others in community. And so if I've seen the students who struggled in the beginning to join into a conversation in an online forum, who didn't want to turn their cameras on, who felt shy about speaking up. And so I really set out at the beginning of creating my class to build that sense of safety and community over anything else, because I knew that without that, we weren't going to be able to accomplish any of our other goals. And so our challenge, I think, as teachers is how do we create that environment, especially in the online arena. And this isn't, I would say this isn't the meat of our work today, but I don't want to jump into talking about building conversation skills without acknowledging this, because again, I think if you don't do this foundational work, it's very hard to get students to engage with one another in any classroom environment, but especially in an online environment. And so I'll just share again the name of that book, and I think Heather or Gail's got it in the chat as well. This is my own professional development. This is what I'm reading to help me think more about creating those community and safe spaces. If you have other things that you're reading or things that have really influenced you with regards to how you create community and safety in your classroom, I hope that you'll chat that out to others. And Mark asked about one strategy that I could share. So I'll start with a strategy about relationship So there's different relationships to manage in the classroom, right? There's the student to teacher relationship, and then there's the student to student relationship. So you're going to see later today an activity, a conversation activity we do that I think helps us to build that student to student trust. But the teacher to student trust for me comes a lot from doing other interactions with students outside of class. I use text messaging a lot to check in with students between classes to see how they're feeling about classwork, what else is going on in their lives. These aren't high pressure interactions. They're just a chance for me to do some relationship building with people one-on-one. The kind of thing that you could do in small interactions before and after class when you're in person, but can be a little bit harder to accomplish online. All right. So when we talk about conversation, I want to emphasize that that is really more than just communication. So a lot of times our job as language teachers feels like it's about communication. How do I express my ideas to someone else in a way that they understand? And certainly we're going to talk a lot about how the things we're going to do today help with building those kinds of communication skills. But also that conversation has to go a little bit further. And I want you to just think a little bit about what would it look like to build skills for engaging conversation and dialogue at every level. And how would it change learning for your students if meaningful conversation among students was expected and supported in the classroom, so that classroom spaces became a space where people felt like part of, people felt listened to and could build on and expand each other's ideas. So that's our big picture idea. That's our work for today. All right, so to get us started, I wanted to share a little clip of my students, a few of my students, the brave ones who were happy to volunteer to be filmed for this presentation. And I'll just say these students have been doing these types of conversations for a long time. There are still things that I think they can continue to improve upon, feedback that I would give them. But what I want us to look at today in this short clip is just what about this conversation to you makes it a meaningful interaction among learners? Okay, in other words, what makes this a good conversation? All
right. Student number 2 and 3, how about we talk about the food? Like question number 2 is talk about a holiday. Oh no, question number what is that? Oh, number 3, talk about a special food that people eat during a holiday or celebration. I can please, students number 2, can you answer the question?
Okay, I answer, right? Okay, I would talk about like my people, my community. Yeah, I would talk, I give an example like Thanksgiving. My community, we the special food for Thanksgiving like the turkey, and we made like sticky rice, and sometimes we make like my own like the chicken together. Yeah, and that is in Thanksgiving, isn't the turkey is a special food for that holiday.
Yeah. Student number 3, would you like to summarize?
Yeah, she said she like Thanksgiving because she like in Turkey. That's what she said. I like in Turkey too. Is you know, I never tried before. I try in this country, especially when they put it to I don't know better or some it's not a spices, different spices. I don't know what kind of spices they put, but I like it. I never got to the recipe, but yeah, it's the first time can I saw to the big turkey cooking, and you know when you cut it, wow, that's what it should say, and I enjoy it too. She make me hungry too.
Okay, student number 2, I'm gonna follow up question. How about in your country? That do you have a food celebration like
Yeah. Yes. In my our country, we didn't have like many holiday in each year, but one is the New Year. When the New Year, we have we kill the pig. The pig. One day, so we just call cousin and I think like cousin, niece, and nephew, like that, come to eat together one day. So another day, like example, like my sister, she had one, so we can go to my sister house, eat together, celebration. Yeah.
All right, great. So I see some people are already starting to add some ideas in the chat. And I'll just give you a couple more minutes to reflect on that clip and what else you noticed or thought was valuable about this conversation for the learners. Great, yeah, so for people who are asking where is the teacher, I actually was in the chat room at the time with my camera off, so you can't see me, but this is an activity that after much practice and skill building, students can moderate on their own in small groups. And again, you know, I'll just remind people, these students are very adept at this. They've been practicing this for a long time. These are also, of course, the students who self-selected to be videotaped for a conference that they knew lots of people would see. So not every student participates at quite the level of fluency that these students do. All right, great. Yeah, I see lots of comments in the chat about student roles, students as moderators, active listening, summarizing, follow-up questions. Okay, so let's go right into. So, like I said, today we're going to focus on 3 conversation moves or skills that people use often in conversation. And these are the 3 that Liddy and I have had a lot of success with teaching our students, and that I have seen them really develop more interactive conversations as a result of these. And you probably noticed some of these in the clip we just watched. So restating or summarizing, right? So when students are giving longer answers, like they were in this conversation, it takes the form of summarizing. And we talk about that you don't need to repeat everything that the speaker said, but listen for the most important ideas and try to repeat those. If you're working with a group of beginning speakers, it might just be simply restating. Someone gives a one-sentence answer, someone else listens and repeats as much of that one-sentence answer as they can. That's how this work begins. Asking follow-up questions. So both of these, both summarizing and asking follow-up questions, really puts everyone in a space of active listening. They know that they have a role that's going to require them to listen and understand what the other person says. And then finally, what turns out to be actually a more advanced skill is adding on to an idea. So listening to someone's idea and then finding a way to give your own idea in a way that connects to theirs. So these are the 3 skills that we're going to focus on today. And with that, we're going to get ready to talk about the same activity that you actually just saw. So I'll hand it over to Liddy.
Yeah, so we're going to talk about what we saw with Jessica's students, or conversation groups, or in my class we call them conversation circles because of the going round and round quality. And I started using these conversation circles in my in-person class, I don't know, a couple of years ago. And they are really wonderful. You know, it gives students a time to talk just for talking. In my in-person class and also in my Zoom class, I often, you know, students do something and then I put them into various groups or partners and they're talking a lot. But the conversation circles were, I made it really clear to them, it's talking for talking. It's talking to get to know other students and to get to know each other. And, you know, like Jessica said earlier, it's all about being known, you know, knowing each other and being known. And who doesn't want to be known by other people, right? So we want to listen to other people and hear people and have these circles. In my in-person class, you know, when this was happening, the room was abuzz. There was excitement. Students were leaning in. We even saw this in the video with Jessica's students. You know, the students were leaning in. They were smiling. They were totally engaged. And in a classroom of many, many circles happening simultaneously, you know, that energy is fabulous. And building relationship and, you know, laughing. When we all switched to remote teaching back last spring, you know, I tried doing this and it took a bit of reworking in my online class. Partly, you know, there's something that rides on the energy in a room that is great, and having it be just these small rooms was a little bit more challenging. However, there still is, and my students still feel like whenever they're in a breakout room and they're talking to each other, they love having that time to engage. They see each other, they engage. They often, at the end of the day, I always have them report on what was helpful in our day, and they always get back to that time in conversation. So we'll talk more as we go about, you know, some of the steps to get there, but it is equally valuable to the students and equally beneficial in the Zoom room.
All right.
So we're going to, yeah.
Yeah, good. Okay, so what we're going to do next is give you an opportunity to experience this as participants, because, you know, what better way to learn than by doing? So you'll receive a couple of questions, and when you get into your small group, one person is going to choose a question and answer it, and you can decide who's going to go first. And then another person in the group will summarize what they just heard that speaker say. And then we're going to ask any remaining group members to ask a follow-up question to the first speaker. And then after you've done that series of moves, then someone else should identify themselves as the new speaker, and they're going to choose one of the two questions and then answer it, and the cycle starts over. Now, you know, that nice sort of circular motion that happens in in-person classroom where everyone stays in the same seat is harder to accomplish in Zoom because not everyone's picture order appears exactly the same in a breakout room. So just, excuse me, what you can do is just say, like you heard the students say, okay, I'll answer the next question. Oh, okay, I'll summarize, right? It turns out that works pretty well. So these are your two conversation questions for today. And just as I do in my class, I'm going to give you a couple options. You can either quick jot these down on paper, or if you have the chat open, we've just chatted those questions out, so then you should still have them when you get into your breakout room. Or as many of my students do, pick up your phone and take a quick screenshot of the screen, and then you are ready to go. All right. So again, as you get into those small groups, you're answering the question, you're summarizing, and you're asking follow-up questions. And what I want you to do is really pay attention to your thinking as you go through it, right? We're doing this as participants because I want you to notice what skills do you really need to use in order to do this? And how does it feel? Okay, how does it feel to participate in a structured conversation like this? Okay, so in just a minute, you should see a pop-up that says you've been assigned to a small group, and you may or may not need to click on join in order to get into your small group. And you'll have about 6 minutes in your small group to talk about those two questions.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and open the rooms now, Jessica.
If you we'll invite you to turn on your camera, turn on your microphone. So if you have something that you would like to actually say out loud to the group, would love to hear you. Please, if you want to do that, put your name in the chat. Say, you know, just type your name, and that will be a signal to us to call on you. And then if you don't want to get your voice out loud and you'd rather put your ideas into the chat, that's also great. We'll read some of those out loud so we can all hear your reflection. So think about, how was that conversation for you? How was the conversation? Was it easy? What was easy? What was challenging? Did the assigned roles affect how you interacted with each other? What skills do you notice yourself using? And how does this inform how you would do this with your students? So think about it. And again, I'd love to hear some of your ideas, what it felt like, what it made you think about. All right, Craig said that assigned roles helped the flow of the conversation. That's great, excellent. Are there other thoughts, other ideas? Yep, more practice with procedure. Yeah, we will get more practice with some of that. Yeah, summarizing made me realize I don't teach listening as much as I should. That's really interesting. I'll talk more about that a little later because I noticed a bit of that in my classroom as well. Someone said it made us feel comfortable when others commented or asked more questions. Right, it really shows that people are hearing us, listening, relating. Absolutely. Great. So we think it's a great routine. Good follow-up question. Got more conversation going. Yep, absolutely. Skills, yeah. Yep, we will talk more about how to build up the skills and do all of those pieces. I'm not seeing anyone volunteering to chat out. If anybody wants to speak up in the group, we'd love to hear you. Technical difficulties are always a challenge. Let's see. more. I'm missing something here. Yeah, so someone said low-level ELL students will need a lot of practice and guidance. We will definitely be talking about that, and it does. It takes time to build up to this. Like Jessica said, we're working backwards, showing you some of the, where we can get to, and it takes a good bit of work to get there. Someone talked about what it feels like in terms of engaging with people that you don't really know, right? And that reminds me of what it means to work with our students. How much do they know each other? But this idea that if we built up that community first, then there's really room to be able to share more about our lives. These are some great comments. Thanks.
I would, hi, I'm Martha
would like to
Hotchkiss. Yeah, I just,
Excellent.
when I was thinking about this, and it's just more effective to say it than to write it.
Yep.
Just, I've noticed when I've had my students in breakout rooms and I had a question, but that was it. Without the roles, and I joined the breakout room with them, and I noticed it would peter out. There was no, with the summarizing and the follow-up questions, it not only engages them in actively listening, the conversation keeps going, because this is how we do conversation. We keep adding on. This is not like this abstract thing that they only do in the classroom. It's really, and it lets them get right down to talking and speaking, rather than futzing with, well, what do I do now? Do I just sit here silent? Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for that, Martha. That's absolutely right. I mean, it's when we do this in my class, we talk about all of those pieces, and I also encourage them to try it at home in their own language. These are some of the things that are useful conversation skills, no matter what language that you're speaking. Yeah, that type of question absolutely plays a big role. That's what we'll be coming up with right after break. I think we're ready to take a little bit of a stretch break, right, Jessica?
Yep. Good. So I don't know about you, but it is time for me to refill my cup of coffee. So we're going to give everybody a quick 10-minute break. That means we will come back at 10:05. I'll put a little timer up on the screen just to keep us all on the same track. And then, yeah, when we come back, we're going to dig into how do you create some simple but powerful questions for your students to discuss. All right, here we go. Let's take a little break. All right, welcome back. We're back, and hopefully you are and ready to go. So we're going to dive in next to talking a little bit about questions, and then after that, I'm really excited to share with you some ideas for building this up from the most beginning levels, including some ideas from talented colleagues of mine who teach really low-level ESL classes. So before we left, there was already starting to generate this interesting conversation in the chat about the importance of cultural sensitivity, of creating that safe space, the different dynamics that might be in play with that, and then thinking about what role do the questions that we ask play in creating those safe spaces and encouraging conversation. So what I'm going to do is try to give you some different tools to help you craft the kind of questions that are best suited to your group. So I don't think that there's necessarily one best way to design your questions. It's going to depend a lot on who your group is and where they're at in terms of creating that sense of community within the class. So general guidelines, I would say, is that you want to keep your questions concise. The goal of this activity is not reading comprehension, so we want the questions to be pretty easy to understand, that they have vocabulary we feel like the students are likely to already know, so that students can jump right into the work of speaking. And that questions are open-ended. And for me, this is a big part of creating safety in the classroom, is that I try to craft questions that are not going to require anyone to share information that they don't want to share or revisit stories that they don't want to revisit. And so, you know, that's what I do in my questions. And then when it comes to follow-up questions, it's important to set ground rules with students that any question that comes up at any point, they have the option to pass on that question, to say that they don't want to answer, or to change the question slightly so that they are comfortable answering it. But you'll notice, even when I put you into small groups, I did ask you to talk about your childhood, something that not all groups might be ready to talk about. But I tried to keep the questions broad enough that you could pick from any number of childhood memories to share. And then you want to make sure that your questions are accessible to all of your students in terms of experiences that are universal, right? We all had childhoods. So that's a universal experience. Whereas sometimes if we start talking about work, I have students who have a lot of work history and students who have no formal work history. And so their experiences are really different. And I need to craft questions that allow them to think about the ideas of work in general, rather than having to talk about their own personal experience of work, which sometimes those who don't have a sort of formal work experience where they had a manager and that type of job, they sometimes have a hard time answering those questions. Okay, so to get started, we're going to have you look at these 3 possible questions. And among these questions, I want you to write in the chat, you can just put number 1, 2, or 3. Which question do you think kind of best fits those criteria we just talked about? Being accessible, being open-ended, being easy to understand, and why? So again, we're going to look at these 3 questions. Do any health problems run in your family? What are some health problems common in older adults? And do you think changes in the weather affect a person's health? Explain your answer. All right, so go ahead and just in the chat, gaining a consensus here pretty quickly. Good. And then if you have ideas about why you chose that one, why you think that one is a good fit for those criteria we just talked about, go ahead and put that in there. Good. I see some people saying, you know, it's number 3. It's not necessarily personal, but you could share personal experience if you wanted to. Mm-hmm. Okay, good. I see someone pointing out that number 1 and 2 feel inappropriate, right? Maybe 2, number 1, you know, is asking for personal health information, right? Which we wouldn't want to ask students to divulge. And number 2 is asking students to make generalizations about a group of people, which depending on the question and the situation, you know, if I was teaching a group of students in a certified nursing assistant program where people were going to be moving into working in a nursing home type of environment, then number 2 might be an appropriate question. But for a general conversation class, I think there's agreement that number 3 is our best. All right. So I'll just share with you some of the things that I try to keep in mind when I'm forming questions. You may have noticed with your students, I certainly noticed with mine, that question format, the grammar of questions, can really be a hindrance sometimes to students' understanding. So if I'm trying to ask a more complex idea, but I want to simplify the grammar, I will often start with a yes/no question or a statement, and then a follow-up or a tag. So to give you an example, how do you think distance learning has changed life for children? Sometimes this is hard because the how do you think part comes at the beginning and it leaves the meat of the question at the end. And so sometimes it's easier for students to digest a question like, has distance learning changed life for children? And then we don't want to leave it there because that question doesn't, with yes or no, doesn't offer us a lot of rich conversation. But then just to tag on how, you know, or to make a statement. So instead of asking, what are some reasons parents might decide to move their child to a different school, right? That is a long kind of wordy question. Might be fine for an advanced group, but we could simplify it by saying, sometimes parents choose a different school for their child. Why? Okay, so some grammar considerations. And then part of creating that safety and willingness for people to participate is that in many cases, especially if I'm not sure about the dynamic in my group, I try to shift the focus from you to a more general question about people, someone, a friend. And so I use question stems like this. So what do people do when? Instead of what do you do in this situation? Okay, so instead of what do you do, changing it to what do people do? How can someone, a lot of times I use this, what do you say to a friend, or what advice would you give to a friend in this situation? Again, it helps people to think sometimes about difficult topics, but distance themselves a little bit emotionally from those. All right. Sorry, I'm trying to move my chat and my slides at the same time. Good. All right. So now I'm going to give you a chance to try this out. I just this past week taught a lesson, really lovely lesson on coping strategies for stress and anxiety, something that I would venture to say is a near universal experience right now. And so I thought this would be a good moment to pause and have us practice. What are some questions that you could ask about this topic without requiring someone to answer based on their own personal life experience? So how could you get at talking about difficult experiences of stress and anxiety, or how we cope with and deal with that experience? So I'm going to give some time here to go ahead and have you chat some things out. And then I'll have Liddy pick out some of those to share. Or if people have comments or questions about choosing questions and forming questions for your small groups, now would be a good time to ask those as well.
I'm going to give you all a minute to think quietly before I start reading, so I'll give you a little bit of quiet thinking time. We've got one so far from Allison. What advice do you think a doctor might give to a patient who says they feel stressed or anxious? What are some things people can do when they feel stressed? Great. Oh, now they're coming so fast. I can't read them all. Great. I'll look through. Yeah, I like this. Start with, we all experience stress. What would you tell a friend who says they're stressed? That's taking great from what Jessica just shared. What do you think Dr. Phil or Dr. Fauci or some celebrity doctor would say to a patient who's stressed or anxious? The general, what can students do to calm themselves when they feel nervous? Speaking in front of a class, really specific, that's great. What can people do to relax? Really simple, not a lot of extra words, really gets at the point. There's some great questions in here. Using a rating scale, that's a way of helping give students some language to begin with, right? Especially some of the beginning students. Here are some beginning ideas that people can use. And then I find that with something like that, once some of those words are in their mouths, some of them can then put more words out there. But by giving some words to begin, it's really helpful. A friend is stressed from work. What would you say to comfort or support them? Or then asking about me. I sometimes feel this way. What should I do? Mm-hmm. Great. Yep. Giving you the teacher advice. That's great. Right. And also like giving, as Rosemary points out, giving an example. Going for a walk helps people relax. What are other ways? Or giving that example is really helpful. Sometimes it helps. I know my students think, oh, that's what you're talking about. That's where you're going with this. If I know where I'm going, it's like giving the first answer. It's great. Jessica, did I miss anything in there? Did you see any more?
I think you got it. Yeah. Okay. These are great. Yeah. And if you haven't had this conversation in your class already, I highly encourage this topic. It's, even paired with sharing out some breathing activities or other things, because everybody's going through this now. And I'm hearing from a lot of parents who are looking for ideas to help their kids coping with stress and anxiety too. So sometimes we can, you know, relate to helping someone else with this issue. It's easier to process and talk about than talking about ourselves as well. Really nice, really nice question ideas.
Really great. Thank you, everybody, for sharing all those.
All right, so we're going to jump into these conversation moves and kind of go back to the beginning. So how do you build up to that larger conversation, guided conversation that we did at the beginning? So remember, our first move is to restate or summarize, ask follow-up questions, and add on to others' ideas. So let's start with the first one, restating or summarizing.
All right, I'll take it here. So restating and summarizing, as many of you pointed out, you know, we saw it in the first conversation from Jessica's students. And, you know, on the one hand, restating something isn't something that we really do in a lot of authentic conversation. You know, you're sitting at the dinner table, you don't say, okay, let me repeat what you just said. That isn't what we do. However, on the other hand, we actually do this. If we don't understand something or we want to make sure, we say, I think I heard you say this. Is that right? Did I get it? And so this restating and summarizing, you know, at first, in what I found when I was practicing it with my students, that at first it feels a little stilted, but as it becomes more practiced, it really becomes this way of clarifying, and students are making sure, we all are making sure that we really understand what somebody is saying. And, you know, and that's really been a powerful thing as it has become a stronger skill for my students. It's a great, you know, way to begin, and I will talk some about that more a little later. But to start with, you know, this was in backing up to this activity of having a conversation circle. The first really hard part for my students was this restating, and so what I've started doing is every day in my remote class, as a welcome activity. From the very beginning, I ask a question to get everybody's voice in the room. And I noticed that people were, you know, answer the question, move on, but there really wasn't much interaction. So when I added somebody, and you don't know who is going to do it until after somebody has shared, but I call on somebody else to restate or summarize. And in the beginning, there's really this, it was really, oh, can you repeat yourself? Because people weren't listening so well, which was a great opportunity to ask that, you know, how do you ask somebody to repeat if you didn't hear it? But it also helped, it helped with that listening. And then they started out at first really just restating exactly what somebody said. One word answer, a few word answer, something like that. But as it has become a stronger thing, it has as their skill of listening and repeating has gotten stronger, and that expectation, it has become much more of a bit of summarizing. And that's taken, you know, that was about 3 or 4 weeks of doing it every day. So it's not a quick, suddenly we catch on, but it takes a good bit of time. The interesting thing about all of these is that it leaks into other places. So students will say, hold on, I didn't understand, I didn't hear you. And sometimes I didn't hear you, but sometimes I didn't understand, which means the speaker then has to back up and say it again, and maybe say it in a different way. So they're learning a whole bunch of different skills in this. Right. So the first part is really just saying it again, repeating it, and then it builds into lots of things. So it can be, you can have it, do it with questions that you're asking, having students repeat. I'll show you later how I've done this with some as a picture activity, and of the really big thing is to step back and let the students do the talking. You know, I found that for a long time, I would restate almost everything that my students would say. And as I've stepped back and gotten out of the way, they've had to do that. They've had to figure out meaning from each other. And that's been really powerful. They've taken responsibility for being more clearer speakers, as well as taking more responsibility for the listening pieces. So from the restating or the summarizing, it's a great beginning. And if this is all that we do for a really long time, it is really powerful and it has big ripple effects out there.
Good. Yeah, and I see a clarification question about, is this the question you asked related to the lesson or to themselves? So what we're suggesting is that if all of this is new to your students, a place you might start is with other lesson activities that you're already doing. Times when you would normally sort of pose a question to the class or pose a question to an individual, build in the expectation that as soon as someone gives an answer, you're going to call on someone else to repeat what they just said or summarize what they just said. And that's really where you get started with this skill. And then that way you're still there with the whole group to help facilitate, so that when someone says like, oh, I don't know what they said, then you can prompt them to ask someone else the clarification question. And that's part of the getting out of the way too, is that you don't turn to the student and say, why don't you repeat that again for them? You ask the one who didn't understand, to ask the other person to repeat. Great. Okay, I want to share again with you a quick video from some of my students. And I asked them in preparation for this how conversation practice in general is helpful to them, and then why they think it's important to practice summarizing.
Oh, we can't hear it, Jessica.
Oh. Hold on just a second. I wonder if something changed in my settings. Let me try again.
I think three benefits.
Good.
One is, what in my English did other people understand what I try to say? The second is, teacher know our pronunciation and she can correct us. And another is how we talk in the group, that like a different people country, then how that different country pronounce the English. Yes.
Great. So we always practice summarizing what other people say. Why do you think it's important or helpful to practice summarizing?
For my idea, it's important to summarize. It's just get idea what the person said in the conversation, so you summarize, like you get what idea they said. You don't need to repeat what they said. So it's important to the idea they said, or the idea the person said.
About me, for practice summarizing is important. Like when I listen another people say, how I can catch all the word that person said, so I can't summarize all that person answer. Yeah, that is.
All right. Good. So I just wanted you to hear directly from them. I was so impressed at how quickly they came up with reasons. They were like ready without much prompting about what they value about this experience. And okay, so this is the part I'm really excited about, because I know we have lots of beginning teachers with us. So in preparation for this, I reached out to a couple of colleagues who work with much lower level speakers of English. And I asked them what they were already doing. And I said, you know, what would you be willing to try some things in order to do more student-to-student speaking and listening interaction. And so one of my colleagues, Barb Murphy, who also works at Literacy Minnesota over on the east side of St. Paul with me, she went right to work and tried a bunch of things and came back with some really specific ideas. So first I want to talk about, in general, if we're talking about starting this work with beginners, or if you have a multi-level group and that includes some beginners, think about grounding the conversation in something concrete. So rather than having a written or spoken conversation question, can you use a picture as your prompt? And chances are that you're already doing something like this, but now you can think about adding the conversational and interactive components to it. So several teachers I talked to said that they have some form of a routine where they use pictures and they ask students, what do you see? Or what are they doing? And they just elicit vocabulary. I asked Barb to try out a new sort of show and tell activity based on what I was actually seeing in my children's elementary school Zoom meetings, where a teacher or student brings an object to their computer and shows it and says something about that object. And then the conversation revolves around that object. If you're getting a little higher up and your students are literate, but they struggle to produce full sentences, think about sentence frames that you could give for a question. So if we go back to that idea of, you know, what helps you relax, then you might put on the screen, to relax, I like to blank. And then that gives students a starting place, right? And it extends their speaking beyond a single word. And then most importantly is you're gonna practice just one conversation move at a time. And so like we were talking about, start with the restating or summarizing. And I got this great email from Barb the other day where she talked about specifically how she started doing this object show and tell with her students. And she teaches a combined low literacy beginning class that includes a lot of students who are really also low beginning speakers of English. It's not just their literacy that's low, they just don't produce that much spoken English yet. And so she talked about doing this with an object, and she said for the first several classes, she as the teacher did the object demonstration. And she said after about a week of demonstrating and offering students the opportunity to bring an object, about a week later, a student brought their own object to the lesson, ready to offer some words or sentences about that object. And so she said, first of all, make sure that you tell students that this is a listening practice, that the first thing they're going to do is practice listening. And then she said, really simplify it down to a few words. Have them just listen for a few words. So for example, if my object was this sweater, so I'd hold it up and make sure that everybody could see it well, right? I might put it on, and then I'd say sweater, orange, soft. Okay, we might repeat that a few times and then call on students to retell what they had just said. And then building that up to a sentence levels, right? This is my sweater. It is orange. It is soft. Okay? Having students try to repeat. So I know that doesn't feel necessarily like the same level of interaction, but that's the precursor to students being able to then listen and repeat what other students say. So if you can build that routine where the teacher is sharing something, students are repeating back what they hear, then your next step is to have students share something, either based on a picture prompt or an object, and have other students repeat back what they heard from that student. Okay, so that's kind of, I want to just give you a picture of what that might look like at your really, really beginning levels. But hopefully you can see it as part of this larger continuum, that if we expect students to do active listening of other students, not just of the teacher, that we're preparing them to be successful in doing that at later stages. Good. Does anybody have other questions or comments about that at the moment? And I'll just say, I'll do my best to answer these. I haven't taught this level for quite a while, so I don't have a lot of direct experience with doing this work at this level. So Rosemary says, would you use the same object more than one time? I think you certainly could, especially you could start to build on the same object, right? So if you're only doing 2 sentences about the object at first, maybe the next time you're able to use those same 2 sentences and a couple sentences more. Okay, good. Yep, somebody said ask those WH questions. I think it'll depend a lot too on when we talk about low levels of ESL, there are really very different profiles of students who end up in a beginning class. And some of them have a fair amount of spoken vocabulary, right? Maybe not in full sentences, but they have a lot of words at their disposal. And some students, like Barb's students, have very little that they know how to produce. So, but yeah, Craig, I think if you've got some students who know their WH words, the who, what, where, when, why, those are great, especially with picture prompts. Those are really great places to start. And then that also leads well into follow-up questions. So we're gonna be talking about follow-up questions in a little bit. Picture or object ideas. We're gonna share a picture resource in a few minutes. Object ideas, I think, can be as simple as really like looking around your immediate space and what do you have that might be, especially if your students are ready to engage in a little bit more conversation, what do you have that might be interesting? Just as I was looking around before this, I was like, oh, I've got this friendship bracelet that my daughter made for me. It's got 3 different colors in it. It's made of string. I can talk about my daughter and how old she is, right? So there's, I don't know that there's a particular recipe to what makes a good object. It's probably going to depend on your group and what they're interested in talking about. Great. Yeah. Okay. So people are already starting to think about how picture prompts might be useful at even higher levels. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit. All right. So let's keep going then. All right. So the second move that my students have practiced and really benefited from a lot is the follow-up questions. And this was, when we were in person, we had this great opportunity to have like monthly coffee hours where we would host a group of community members from the congregation that we're housed in. So we share a building with a congregation and they wanted to volunteer, but on a less frequent basis. So students would get together for these informal conversations, and I quickly realized they were having such a hard time keeping the conversation going because they just didn't have the skills to listen for details and form follow-up questions. And so we started working on that first in writing. So in writing, that would look like me giving them a sentence or 2 like this. My sister got married last week in Florida, and then asking them to think of 3 more follow-up questions that they could ask. And sometimes this needs to be paired with some grammar instruction on question formation, because the grammar of questions is complex. But sometimes also students can string together some questions that might not be fully grammatically correct, but will communicate their ideas pretty quickly. And I just did this recently in my online class, just using the chat. So I did the same thing. I made a slide with a couple of details and then asked students to write follow-up questions in the chat. All right, so here's some reflections from students about follow-up questions. And as you listen to them talk, I want you to think a little bit about, we talked at the beginning, I said that conversation is more than communication. So as you're listening, what evidence do you hear from students that they're beginning to move beyond just basic communication? One more question. We also practiced asking follow-up questions. And why do you think it's important to practice asking follow-up questions?
For that question, important to practice asking follow-up question to make, like, for me, like, to make my brain to how faster I listen the question the answer from that person say, but I already catch the answer, so I can make question to different way.
Yeah, for me, follow-up question is important for me, for my idea, because sometimes when somebody, so sometimes like somebody says sometime, if I listen, oh, I cut something, it's very important. Or I hear something I never hear before, or maybe something important. So I ask question about what is for, what is this, like ask question. So follow-up question for me is important in that way.
It helps you to get more details?
Yeah, more details.
Yeah, for me, the same, like Sarah said, I can give extra information. Sometimes the speaker, they could forget to say something that important situation, what is in there, then we can like remind them and we got extra information.
All right, good. I'm just going to keep going. One more question. Whoops, in the interest of time, but we get to everything we've got here. All right. And Liddy, I'll hand it over to you.
Great. So the last conversation move is about adding on to an idea. And it definitely comes up in some of the, in the group, in the conversation circles, but in a lot of ways, I see this more in the group conversations and a whole class conversation. You're talking about something and you want someone to really be listening and say, oh yeah, I agree with the things that Jessica said because of this and this and this. Or, Jessica said this idea, I'd like to add to what she said and add this new idea to the conversation. Or I'd like to say one more thing about conversation. And the sentence frames is a great starting place. And I try to model this for my students, or I ask them, can you add on to what this other person said? And the more I'm working on the skill, the more I'm asking them to add on. And that's been really helpful. Another place so that I tried using this or giving them some really good focus practice is with pictures. So the next slide, please. The New York Times has a wonderful collection of pictures, and it's called What's Going On in This Picture? And we'll put it out in the chat. It's, if you Google what's going on in this picture, New York Times, they have every week, they post a picture, and these pictures are really rich in story. And so the basic questions, you know, according to the lesson plan that the Times has set up, it's a curriculum called Visual Thinking Strategies, which is a wonderful curriculum. But I've taken it, I used that with kids years and years ago, but it's also great to engage people in looking really carefully. So the question is, what's going on in this picture? And I ask students, you know, what do you see? What's going on? So to begin with, students will talk about, oh, I see people with cameras. Oh, I see people wearing white jackets. I see people with things on their heads. But I'm asking them also to tell about the story. So I invite them to, after they hear what one person said, to add on. Oh, I heard someone say there's white coats, and I also see this other thing. Or I heard somebody say they think that this is during coronavirus. This is what one of my students said, because I think they're all doctors. And someone said, yeah, I agree. I think they're all doctors. They look like they're in a hospital. And so that was a way for them to both listen and add on to an idea. And these pictures are really great. It's really fast because it's a shared experience. They don't have to, it's not going into their own personal things, you know, to begin with. It's right there, and we can really share it. Yeah, so they can use it, but it was also, what I found was it was challenging, right? Some of them could get it right away and they were listening, but then to remember it. So we broke it down. I broke it down into, you know, the other piece of, well, what if I have them first do some restating? So so this is really great for adding on, but if we just do the what do you see piece first and practice that, I would have them look at a picture that doesn't quite have as much story. And these pictures came from, let's see, the boats came from, I think, Unsplash or Upsplash. I forget what that one is called exactly. The car picture came from National Geographic. And so to start with, I would say, you know, I would have them do that game of, you know, I see this, and then the next person says, I see this. So my classmate sees a yellow car, I see a palm tree. And the next person says, one person saw a yellow car, somebody else saw a palm tree, I see that it's a beautiful summer day. And so first it's all of that restating, and then they would add on and I want to add that I also see this. So again, it's the giving. I found that by giving them a picture to focus on, starting by restating and summarizing just the ideas. If you leave it at that, that's excellent. It's that practice that we were saying before, just like the objects, just what do you see here? We started this when we were focusing on adjectives. And so this is a great place to practice the tall tree, the building, the yellow car, all of those things. But then we also use it to say, I agree, that's a tall building, and it's also, and it also looks like a hotel. I'm going to add on that it looks like something else. And so there's that language and that practice of putting these things together that has been really helpful.
Great. All right. Liddy, you want to get us ready for our next small group?
Yes. So we've been talking about ways that we've used all of these ideas. You've added some great questions into the chat, and I know that you're thinking about how you might take these and run with them. So we're going to give you a chance to you're going to get back into breakout rooms. We'll put you back in with the same people from before. And what we want you to think about and talk about is, how would you introduce and teach these? How would you use restating or summarizing with your students? How would you get them to ask more follow-up questions? How can you help them to add on to an idea? So we're going to put you into breakout rooms so you can engage with your fellow educators. And what we want you to do is talk about this. We're going to give you about 10 minutes. And we want to challenge you, be a good conversationalist. How can you use any of these skills that we've talked about in your conversation talking about these things? So a little meta challenge in here.
Great. And I'll just add, I know some people had some technical problems in the small groups and some people are leaving. So if you get into a group and you don't have anyone to talk to, or you're having technical difficulties, there is usually an option to press a ask for help button that will give us a message and we can pop in and help you. Or if that's not working, you can always leave your group and come back to the main room where Liddy and I will be, and then we'll facilitate getting you into another group or helping with your tech problem. All right. Okay, Gail, I think we're ready to start this morning.
Debrief exactly right now, but we will leave time for questions. So anything that bubbled up in your conversations, we'll answer questions and those things at the end. We want to address a little bit of some of the, some of the challenges, the classroom management and ideas. I've gotten questions in the past. Well, how do you get students to buy into this? How do you get them to really join? And as Jessica and I have been talking about this, with in both of our classes, and as Jessica said earlier, when we give them tell them what we're doing, why we're doing it, it makes a huge difference. And so I always make it really clear what we're practicing is speaking and listening. This is not a reading activity. So even though you might have to read the questions, the goal is to be talking and asking the questions. So I will give them a lot of support in practicing reading the questions, making sure they know what the questions are. In an in-person class, I would hand them a piece of paper with 10 or 12 questions on it. In my online classes, it's a shorter list of questions, but still the goal is not about how do you read the question, the goal is speaking and listening. I've often then seen people sit back, it's like, okay, great, that's all I need to do, talk and listen. I usually tell them what the content practice is. If we are working on the past tense, then we're practicing, the questions will all guide them to talk about the past. So the goal here is practicing asking questions and answering questions in the past. Or if we're doing a unit that is about the environment, then I want you talking about the environment, or whatever the content is as a broad goal. That's the big idea. We're practicing this idea through conversation. And I always make it really clear that one of the most important things is that they're learning about their classmates. They are becoming known and they are getting to know each other. And again, like Jessica mentioned earlier, I make it really clear to them that they are adults. They can share what they want, as much as they want and as little. And if they hit something that they don't want, this is a great practice to say, no, I'm going to talk about something else. So we talk about how they can practice that piece. And if they don't, my guess is your students will be pretty happy to have conversations, but thinking about, ask them, where do they want to use conversation outside of class? Getting to some of those real world goals. Whether you say, oh, we're doing this so you can do this, is fine, but I bet that they could generate these real world goals as well. And every so often, in reflection, I give them that opportunity to say, well, I've used this recently. I ask them to talk about when they've used any of these skills outside of class, or I invite them to think, how could they take what they did today into the outside part? So I think that having that opportunity is really important. The other thing is the questions that we've both gotten is about, what do you do in the moment when things are, a bit challenging? So one of the things that has come up is, what do you do with people when they have trouble understanding each other? I also, in the goal part, in the speaking and listening part, I tell them, you're going to be in a group with people who probably have accents that are difficult to understand. And they nod their heads, yeah, everybody's accent is so hard to understand. And I also remind them that what that means, of course, is that your accent is going to be difficult for your classmates to understand. So that means and they're like, oh yeah, right, that's right. So your job as a speaker is to make yourself clear and understood, whether that means you're opening your mouth more, you're speaking more slowly. And it also means that you need to, if you don't understand, you need to ask. So we do that practice again of how do you say, please repeat what you said. Can you say that again? I didn't understand. It gives students the opportunity to both practice their pronunciation, and it gives students the opportunity to come at an idea in a different way. And like I said before, watching that happen has been really gratifying as a teacher, to watch these students, come at an idea in a different direction. And that really has happened because I've gotten more out of their way and I haven't taken over that translating role. The other thing, if somebody is a reluctant speaker or wants to answer all the time. I mean, I always have had this in my in-person classes, and what I've noticed in my online class, I always have a couple of students who seem to think that it's a one-on-one conversation. I've got 10 or 12 people in the room, but every time I ask a question, I've got one or two that really are right there answering. And one of them I realized just the other day is joining Zoom on their phone, and I think they've got their earbuds in, and so they think maybe it's a phone conversation. So it's just me and her talking. But in the one of the ways I've addressed that is with the conversation skills. By assigning these jobs, I talk about the idea that some people have lots to say, and that's great. And some people don't, are much more shy. So as a group, it is your job to invite all the people to speak. And if you're the person who really likes to talk, great. When it's your turn, you need to talk. And when it's not your turn, you really need to listen and let the other person speak. And as a great listener, great, listen to the person who likes to talk, but they're going to leave you space. And when it is really your job to speak up. And so I am really kind of strict with what everybody's jobs are, at least in the beginning. And I ask them, I mean, some of you saw in Jessica's the first group conversation that we saw, they were really taking some of that responsibility for each other. And I really encourage the whole group to invite each other to speak and invite each other to be in a conversation, and to remind each other to slow down and be quiet so that somebody else can do that. And I name it, I name, if you're the person who talks a lot, and those people usually nod their heads, yes. And that by naming it sometimes it dissipates that. Another thing with the online, in person, I would give them a paper. Jessica showed a great picture of that, and you could turn it. So first, it's my job is to ask a question, and somebody else's job, and you turn that piece of paper on the table, and then everybody can see what their jobs are. That's awesome. Harder to do in a Zoom room. A couple of ideas. One, if your students are facile with changing their names, you could have them put a number. So I could put 1, Liddy, 2, Jessica could change her name and be number 2, Gail could change her name and be number 3, and then they know their jobs. That's one idea for, going in a circle. Or the other thing I've done is I've put up a chart, job 1, job 2, job 3, job 4, and I put the names on there. And then I say, after you've gone through one question, then it's going to change. Now, the person who did this is going to do this. And so we practice reading a chart, and they at least see that their jobs change all the time. I don't really care who is, what order they're doing it in, all of that, but it gives them that after they'd done it a couple times and had a little struggled with it, that helped them see the rotation and some of that movement.
Great. All right, and then finally, just encouraging you, if small groups are something new that you haven't done much, there's some logistics you want to think about ahead of time. So you want to think about how you'll group students, whether it'll be random or strategic, and how many in a group. For the conversation circle activity, I recommend 3 to 5. More than 5 gets a little unruly. Fewer than 3, well, if you're just down to 2, that's a lot of pressure on each individual. So 3, 4, 5 makes a great group. Think about what you will have students do while you're arranging the group. So if you're new to the features of creating breakout rooms, it can take a little bit to get used to. Think about having something on the screen that students can engage with or practice or write down while you're working on creating your group, so that they're not just sitting there watching you. Think about how you'll provide questions. Are you going to copy them into the chat? Are you going to have students write them down off of a slide? You're going to send them out to them ahead of time. Or, as I often do, we do the questions as a dictation activity. So it's part of our classroom routine to do some dictation, which students like doing. And then they all have the questions on a piece of paper in front of them, which is sometimes helpful for staying focused. And then how will you monitor the groups? So it might be that you want to pop into each group on your own. It might be that you recruit some volunteers. This is a really excellent job for community volunteers who can learn a routine well and become really experts at facilitating those routines. And in that case, I lead a class like that, and students and volunteers can keep one conversation going for half an hour when they have that extra support. And then that extra support also provides more opportunities for feedback, which my students all say that they want. They want help with their pronunciation. They want some feedback about their grammar. They want help with choosing the best words to help them get across their ideas. So those are just some additional kind of logistical considerations to think about if you're new to creating small groups and you're planning to do that. All right, we are near the end of our time, folks. Whew, we have just a couple minutes left. So I invite you, if you have questions, you can turn on your microphone or put your question in the chat, and we will try to get to as many of those as we can. Somebody asked if you can broadcast questions into breakout rooms. No, this is the feature that I would most love to have in Zoom, is the ability to sort of share a screen or something. So you can broadcast a message to everyone in rooms, but it only remains there for just a few seconds. So it doesn't really work for questions. But if you put questions into the chat before the breakout rooms start, and if everyone has the chat open before the breakout rooms start, then when they go into breakout rooms, it will still be in their chat.
I've had some success with students. Some of my more tech savvy students can take a screenshot, and then they will share their screen if I remember to hit the right button that allows them to do that. But it's the opening up the chat has been one of the most successful, or the taking pictures of the questions.
Great, and Gail has added the link to the program flyer if you're trying to figure out what's next and where to go next. And I just want to thank everybody for joining us and participating, and I hope it was useful and you have some things you can take back and start to put into action in your classes. We'll stay here for just a few more minutes. If anybody wants to ask a burning question, but otherwise we are finished, and thank you so much.
Jessica and Liddy, this was great.